The gunshot echoed across the vast, crimson landscape as Grace Calloway watched her last bullet miss the jackrabbit that would have been her dinner. Her stomach growled in protest, reminding her that it had been 2 days since she'd eaten anything substantial. The year was 1876, and the unforgiving Colorado wilderness cared little that she was a woman alone, or that she was running out of options faster than she was running out of daylight. Grace tucked a loose strand of auburn hair behind her ear and surveyed the darkening horizon. The setting sun painted the sky in shades of orange and purple, a beautiful scene that belied the danger of a night alone in these parts. Her horse had gone lame 3 miles back, forcing her to continue on foot with only her father's old rifle, a canteen half full of water, and a small pack of dwindling supplies. She had left Denver with hope and determination, heading to her uncle's homestead near Silverton after receiving news of his illness. But the journey had proven more treacherous than she'd anticipated. A thunderstorm had spooked her horse, causing it to step in a prairie dog hole. Now she was facing the prospect of spending the night without shelter or fire. As twilight deepened, Grace spotted a faint glow in the distance, a campfire. Relief flooded through her, quickly followed by wariness. A fire meant people, and people in these parts weren't always the kind you wanted to encounter, especially if you were a woman traveling alone. But the cold night wind that began to whip around her made the decision easy. She would approach cautiously, assess the situation, and hope for the best. Grace gripped her rifle tighter and started walking toward the distant light. The closer she got, the more details she could make out. A single figure sat by the fire, the silhouette unmistakably that of a man. A horse was tethered nearby, along with what appeared to be a pack mule. The man hadn't noticed her approach yet, giving Grace time to observe from the shadows of a large boulder. He wore the typical attire of a cowboy, a wide-brimmed hat pulled low, a weathered coat, and boots that had seen many miles. A revolver rested at his hip, and a rifle leaned against a nearby saddle. From what she could tell in the firelight, he appeared to be cooking something in a small pot over the flames. The smell of coffee and beans reached her nostrils, and her stomach clenched painfully. Grace knew she had 2 options: slip away and face the night alone, or approach the stranger and hope for mercy. The thought of another night without food or warmth made her decision. Gathering her courage, Grace emerged from her hiding place. "Hello there," she called, staying far enough away that she could retreat if necessary. "I don't mean to intrude." The man's hand instantly went to his holster as he stood up, alert and ready. When he saw it was a woman, his posture relaxed slightly, though wariness remained evident in his stance. "Madam," he acknowledged with a nod, his voice deep and graveled, "you're a fair piece from anywhere civilized." "I know," Grace replied, keeping her rifle pointed downward but ready. "My horse went lame a few miles back. I saw your fire end." She hesitated, pride making it difficult to ask for help, but necessity won out. "I could use a place by your fire for the night if you'd be willing." The cowboy studied her for a long moment, his face partially hidden by the shadow of his hat. Finally, he gestured toward the fire. "Got beans and coffee, not much, but you're welcome to share." Relief washed over Grace, but she remained cautious. "Thank you, Mr. Vance Thornton," he replied, moving back to give her space to approach the fire. "And you?" "Grace Calloway," she answered, stepping closer to the warmth of the flames. The fire's glow revealed more of Vance's features: a strong jawline covered in several days' worth of stubble, piercing blue eyes, and a small scar that ran through his right eyebrow. He was younger than she'd initially thought, perhaps 30 or so. "Where you headed, Miss Calloway?" Vance asked, returning to his place and stirring the pot of beans. "Silverton. My uncle's fallen ill, and I'm all the family he has left." Grace set her rifle down within easy reach and settled onto a rock opposite him. "I didn't expect the journey to be quite so eventful." A ghost of a smile touched Vance's lips. "The West has a way of making every journey eventful one way or another." He spooned beans into a tin plate and handed it to her along with a cup of strong black coffee. "Eat. You look like you could use it." Grace accepted both gratefully, trying not to appear too eager as she began to eat. The beans were simple fare, but at that moment, they tasted better than the finest meal she'd ever had in Denver. "Thank you," she said between bites. "I haven't eaten since yesterday morning." Vance nodded, saying nothing as he ate from his own plate. He wasn't much for conversation, it seemed, but his silence wasn't uncomfortable. There was something reassuring about his quiet confidence, the way he seemed at ease in this wild country. As the night grew deeper, and the stars emerged in brilliant clusters overhead, Grace found herself relaxing despite the unusual circumstances. The warmth of the fire and the food in her stomach made her drowsy, but she fought against sleep, still uncertain of her safety. "I can tend to the fire while you rest," she offered, noticing how the flames had begun to die down. "It's the least I can do for your hospitality." Vance looked up at her, those blue eyes studying her with an intensity that made her breath catch. Then, to her surprise, he reached for her hand and placed it flat against his chest. Through the rough fabric of his shirt, she could feel the steady, strong beat of his heart. "It's yours," he said simply, his voice low and sincere. The gesture was so unexpected, so intimate, that Grace found herself speechless. She felt the warmth of his chest beneath her palm, the rhythm of his heartbeat, and something profound passed between them in that moment, something beyond words. She began, but couldn't find the words to continue. "The fire," Vance clarified, though the look in his eyes suggested he meant something more. "And my protection for the night, they're yours. Rest easy, Miss Calloway. No harm will come to you while I'm here." Grace slowly withdrew her hand, feeling a blush creep up her cheeks. "Thank you," she said softly, "but I still insist on taking a turn with the watch. You need rest too, Mr. Thornton." A small smile played at the corners of his mouth. "Vance," he corrected. "And if you're determined, I won't argue. Wake me in a few hours." He arranged his bedroll nearby and offered her a blanket from his pack. As he settled onto his side, hat pulled low over his eyes, Grace remained by the fire, watching the flames dance and thinking about the strange turn her journey had taken. There was something about Vance Thornton that intrigued her, a depth beneath his stoic exterior that made her curious. In Denver, she had been courted by merchants and bankers, men of means who offered security but sparked little interest in her heart. Out here, with danger all around and uncertainty ahead, she found herself drawn to this quiet cowboy in a way she couldn't explain. Grace added another log to the fire and watched the sparks rise toward the star-filled sky. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but for tonight, she was safe. And for reasons she wasn't ready to examine too closely, that knowledge brought her more comfort than it should have. The night passed quietly, with Grace eventually waking Vance for his turn at watch. When morning came, she opened her eyes to find him already up, coffee brewing and bacon sizzling in a small pan. "You let me sleep," she accused gently, sitting up and smoothing her hair. "Figured you needed it more than I did," he replied, handing her a cup of coffee. "Got plans for getting to Silverton now that you're without a horse." Grace sipped the strong, bitter liquid, grateful for its warmth. "I hadn't thought that far ahead yet. I suppose I'll have to walk until I reach the next town and see if I can arrange transportation from there." Vance frowned, turning the bacon in the pan. "Next town's Durango. That's nearly 30 miles from here. Rough country between, especially for someone on foot." "I don't have much choice," Grace said, trying to sound more confident than she felt. "My uncle needs me." Vance was quiet for a moment, seeming to consider something. Finally, he spoke. "I'm headed to Silverton myself. Got business there that can't wait. You're welcome to ride with me." Grace looked at him in surprise. "You're going to Silverton?" He nodded, dishing out bacon onto 2 plates. "Got a lead on a man I've been tracking. Word is he's holed up there." "Tracking?" Grace asked, suddenly wary. "Are you a lawman, bounty hunter?" Vance replied, his expression unreadable. "Man I'm after killed 3 people during a bank robbery in Pueblo. Got a price on his head." Grace absorbed this information, uncertain how to feel about it. On one hand, traveling with a bounty hunter meant protection. On the other, it might mean walking into danger. "I don't want to complicate your work," she said carefully. Vance handed her a plate of bacon. "You won't. I'll drop you at your uncle's place before I go looking for my quarry." "Why would you help me?" Grace asked, unable to keep the suspicion from her voice. Vance looked at her directly, those blue eyes intense in the morning light. Because it's the right thing to do, and because these parts aren't kind to those traveling alone man or woman. There was sincerity in his words that Grace couldn't doubt. Despite the short time she'd known him, she felt she could trust Vance Thornton. Perhaps it was foolish, but her instincts had rarely led her astray. "Then I accept your offer and I thank you for it," she said. "How soon can we leave?" "Soon as we finish eating and pack up camp," Vance replied. "Should reach Silverton by nightfall if we push hard." They ate in companionable silence, and Grace helped him pack up the campsite. When it came time to mount, Vance surprised her by offering her his horse, a sturdy buckskin gelding. "I'll ride the mule," he said when she protested. "Buck here is steadier, and you look like you could use a comfortable ride after yesterday." Touched by his consideration, Grace allowed him to help her into the saddle. His hands were strong at her waist, lifting her effortlessly. When she was settled, their eyes met briefly, and something unspoken passed between them again, a spark of connection that neither acknowledged aloud. They set off as the sun climbed higher in the sky, Vance leading the way through the rugged terrain. For hours, they traveled in silence, the landscape gradually changing as they moved deeper into the mountains. Pine forests replaced the open prairie, and the air grew cooler as they gained elevation. Around midday, they stopped by a clear mountain stream to rest and water the animals. Grace slid from the saddle, wincing at the stiffness in her legs. She wasn't used to riding for such extended periods. "How much farther?" she asked, stretching her back. "Another 15 miles or so," Vance replied, checking the mule's packs. "Trail gets steeper from here." Grace nodded, moving to the stream to splash cool water on her face. As she straightened, she caught Vance watching her, his expression thoughtful. He quickly looked away when their eyes met, busying himself with adjusting his saddle. "You said your uncle is ill," he said after a moment. "What ails him?" "I'm not entirely sure," Grace admitted. "The letter I received was vague, said he'd taken a bad turn and needed family. Uncle Henry is getting on in years, and he's been alone since my aunt passed 2 winters ago." "Henry Calloway?" Vance asked, looking up with interest. "Runs the assay office in Silverton," Grace nodded, surprised. "You know him, met him once or twice. Honest man, respected in town." Vance handed her a strip of jerky from his pack. "Didn't know he had family back east, Denver," Grace corrected, accepting the dried meat, "and it's just me now. My parents died in a fire 5 years ago." Something like understanding flashed across Vance's face. "Sorry to hear that," he said simply, but the words carried genuine sympathy. "And you?" Grace asked, curious about this man who had so unexpectedly become her traveling companion. "Do you have family somewhere?" Vance's expression closed off slightly. "Had a brother, lost him in the war. Parents passed when I was young." "So you're alone too," Grace said softly. "Been that way a long time," Vance replied, his tone indicating the subject was closed. "We should move on if we want to reach Silverton before dark." They remounted and continued their journey, the trail growing steeper and more challenging as Vance had warned. The afternoon sun filtered through the pine trees, casting dappled shadows across the path. Despite the difficult terrain, Grace found herself enjoying the journey, the beauty of the mountains, and though she was reluctant to admit it, the company of her silent companion. As they rode, Grace noticed that Vance was constantly alert, his eyes scanning their surroundings, hand never far from his revolver. It was a reminder of the dangers that lurked in this wilderness and of the man's profession. She wondered what kind of life he led, always hunting dangerous men, always moving from town to town. "How did you become a bounty hunter?" she asked when they paused to navigate a particularly treacherous section of trail. Vance was quiet for so long that Grace thought he might not answer. Finally, he spoke, his voice low. "After the war, I tried ranching, didn't take to it, served as a deputy for a spell in Kansas, learned I had a knack for tracking men who didn't want to be found." He shrugged. "Pay is good when you catch your man, allows me to keep moving." "Is that what you want?" "To keep moving," Grace pressed, finding herself genuinely interested in his answer. Vance glanced at her, his expression unreadable. "Never found a reason to stop," he said simply. The answer held a loneliness that resonated with Grace. Though she had lived in Denver among society, She too had felt adrift since losing her parents, never quite finding her place. She wondered if Vance Thornton was searching for something just as she was, though neither could name exactly what they sought. As the afternoon wore on, the trail began to descend, and soon they could see Silverton nestled in the valley below a collection of wooden buildings surrounded by towering mountains, with mine operations visible on the nearby slopes. "There it is," Vance said, drawing his mule to a halt beside her. "Your uncle's place should be near the center of town, by the assay office." Grace felt a mixture of relief and unexpected regret. Their journey was coming to an end, and soon she would part ways with this enigmatic man who had shown her such unexpected kindness. "Thank you," she said, turning to face him, "for everything. I'm not sure what would have happened if you hadn't been there last night." "No need for thanks," Vance replied, his eyes meeting hers. "Anyone would have done the same." "No," Grace said firmly, "not anyone. Most men would have sent me on my way or—" She didn't finish the thought, but they both knew what often happened to women alone in the wilderness. Vance's jaw tightened, and for a moment something fierce flashed in his eyes. "Then most men aren't worth the powder it would take to blow them to hell," he said quietly. The blunt statement, delivered with such conviction, made Grace smile despite herself. "No, I suppose they're not." They continued down the trail towards Silverton, the sound of activity growing louder as they approached hammering from the woodworker's shop, piano music drifting from a saloon, the general bustle of a mining town at the end of a workday. Grace found herself studying the town anxiously, wondering what awaited her. Would her uncle's condition be grave? How long would she need to stay? And what would become of Vance once he completed his business here? As if reading her thoughts, Vance spoke. "I'll be staying at the Silver Dollar Hotel while I'm in town. If you need anything, you can find me there." Grace nodded, touched by his continued concern. "I appreciate that." They rode down the main street, drawing curious glances from townspeople. A woman arriving with a bounty hunter was bound to start gossip, but Grace found she didn't care. Let them talk. She knew the truth of their encounter, and nothing else mattered. Vance guided them to a modest two-story building with a sign that read Silverton Assay Office. Next to it stood a small house that must be her uncle's residence. A light burned in the window despite the early hour, suggesting someone was indeed home. Grace's heart quickened with anxiety as they drew to a stop. Vance dismounted first, then moved to help her down from the buckskin. His hands were strong and steady at her waist, and when her feet touched the ground, they lingered a moment longer than necessary. Their eyes met, and Grace felt that same inexplicable connection they'd shared by the fire. "Thank you again," she said softly. Vance nodded, stepping back. "I'll wait until you're inside. Make sure your uncle is here." Grace appreciated the gesture more than she could express. Taking a deep breath, she approached the house and knocked on the door. After a moment, she heard shuffling footsteps, and then the door swung open to reveal a thin, elderly man with white hair and a lined face. "Uncle Henry," Grace said, relief flooding through her at the sight of him. Though frail, he didn't appear to be at death's door as she had feared. "Grace." Henry Calloway's eyes widened with surprise, then filled with joy. "My dear girl, you came. I didn't think you'd receive my letter so quickly." "I left as soon as I got it," Grace explained, embracing him gently. "Your letter said you were ill." Henry waved a dismissive hand. "Had a bout of pneumonia last month. Doc thought it might take me, so I wrote. Been recovering since, though I'm not as strong as I used to be." Grace turned to look at Vance, who stood respectfully by the horses. "Uncle Henry, this is Mr. Vance Thornton. He helped me when my horse went lame on the journey. I wouldn't have made it here without him." Henry studied Vance with shrewd eyes. "The bounty hunter," he said, recognition in his voice. "Heard you were coming to town. Didn't expect you'd be bringing my niece." "Sir," Vance said with a nod. "Found Miss Calloway in need of assistance. Seemed the right thing to do." Henry's expression softened. "Then I owe you my thanks, Mr. Thornton. Please come inside. The least I can offer is a proper meal for bringing my Grace safely to me." Vance hesitated, glancing toward the town. "Appreciate the offer, but I should see to my business." "Your man isn't going anywhere tonight," Henry said firmly. "Word in town is he's holed up at the miners' camp outside town and they don't move around after dark. Come, break bread with us. Your hunt can wait until morning." Grace found herself hoping Vance would accept. To her relief, after a moment's consideration, he nodded. "Much obliged, Mr. Calloway. Let me see to the animals first." While Vance took the horses and mule to the small stable behind the house, Grace entered her uncle's home. It was a modest but comfortable dwelling, with a small parlor, kitchen, and what appeared to be 2 bedrooms off a short hallway. "Your room is ready," Henry said, noticing her looking around. "Always kept it prepared, hoping you might visit someday." Grace felt a pang of guilt. She should have come sooner, not waited for news of illness to make the journey. "I'm sorry it took so long, Uncle Henry." "Nonsense," he replied kindly. "You're here now, and that's what matters. Now tell me about your journey while I put on some coffee." As Grace helped her uncle prepare a simple but hearty meal of venison stew and biscuits, she recounted her misadventures since leaving Denver, including the loss of her horse and her chance encounter with Vance. She found herself glossing over certain details, like the moment by the fire when Vance had placed her hand on his chest, feeling oddly protective of the memory. Henry listened attentively, occasionally asking questions or offering sympathetic comments. When she finished her tale, he regarded her thoughtfully. "Providence has a way of putting the right people in our path when we need them most," he said. "Seems Mr. Thornton was exactly where he needed to be." Before Grace could respond, there was a knock at the door. Henry went to answer it, returning with Vance, who had removed his hat and made an attempt to tidy his appearance. His dark hair was damp at the edges, suggesting he'd washed his face and hands before joining them. "Animals are settled," he reported, "fed and watered." "Thank you," Grace said, suddenly feeling shy in his presence. In the domestic setting of her uncle's home, the dynamic between them felt different, more personal somehow. They sat down to the meal, and Grace was surprised by how comfortable it felt, the 3 of them around the table as if they'd shared many such evenings before. Vance was respectful and attentive, answering Henry's questions about his work and the state of affairs in the territories he'd traveled through. As the meal progressed, Grace found herself watching Vance when he wasn't looking her way. In the lamplight, his features seemed softer than they had on the trail, the lines around his eyes suggesting he smiled more than he let on. The careful way he held his fork hinting at a gentleness that belied his dangerous profession. "So, Mr. Thornton," Henry said as they finished eating, "how long do you expect to be in Silverton?" Vance set down his coffee cup. "Depends on how quickly I can locate my quarry. Could be a day, could be longer." "Well, you're welcome to take your meals here while you're in town," Henry offered. "Least I can do for the man who helped my niece." Grace looked at her uncle in surprise. It was an unexpectedly generous offer, and one that would mean seeing more of Vance in the coming days. The thought brought a warmth to her chest that she tried to ignore. "That's kind of you, sir," Vance replied, his eyes briefly meeting Grace's across the table. "But I wouldn't want to impose." "Nonsense," Henry insisted. "Grace is an excellent cook, far better than the fare you'll get at the hotel. Isn't that right, my dear?" Put on the spot, Grace felt a blush rise to her cheeks. Yes, I enjoy cooking, and it would be no imposition at all, Mr. Thornton. As my uncle said, it's the least we can do." Vance studied her for a moment, as if trying to determine if the offer was genuine. Finally, he nodded. "Then I accept, with gratitude." The evening continued pleasantly, with conversation flowing more easily than Grace would have expected. She learned that Vance had grown up in Missouri, that he had fought for the Union during the war, and that he had been tracking bounties for nearly 5 years. In turn, he listened attentively as she spoke of her life in Denver, her work as a teacher at a small school for girls, and her love of literature. "Never had much schooling myself," Vance admitted, "but I've always enjoyed a good book when I can get my hands on one. What do you like to read?" Grace asked, genuinely curious. "History mostly, some poetry when the mood strikes," Vance replied, a hint of self-consciousness in his tone. "Whitman, when I can understand him." The admission surprised and delighted Grace. A bounty hunter who read Whitman was not what she had expected. "I have a volume of his work with me," she said. "You're welcome to borrow it while you're here." Something like pleasure flickered in Vance's eyes. "I'd like that," he said softly. As the evening grew late, Vance finally rose to take his leave. "Thank you for the meal and the company," he said, retrieving his hat. It's been a long while since I've enjoyed either so much. You'll come for breakfast, Henry asked. 7 o'clock, Vance nodded. I'll be here. His eyes found Grace's. Good night, Miss Calloway. Good night, Mr. Thornton, she replied, wishing suddenly that he didn't have to go. And, it's Grace, please. A smile touched his lips, transforming his face. Grace, he repeated, the name sounding different in his deep voice. Then I'm Vance. After he had gone, Henry turned to Grace with a knowing look in his eyes. Interesting man, your bounty hunter. He's not my bounty hunter, Grace protested, busying herself with clearing the table to hide her flushed cheeks. Henry chuckled. If you say so, my dear, if you say so. That night, as Grace settled into the small but comfortable bedroom her uncle had prepared for her, she found her thoughts returning to Vance. There was something about him that drew her, a depth of character, a quiet strength, a solitary nature that somehow matched her own despite their different backgrounds. It was foolish, she knew, to feel this way about a man she had just met, a man whose profession kept him constantly moving from place to place. And yet, as she drifted toward sleep, she couldn't help wondering what it might be like to be the reason Vance Thornton finally stopped running. The next morning dawned clear and crisp, with sunlight streaming through the small window of Grace's room. She rose early, eager to help her uncle with breakfast before Vance arrived. To her surprise, Henry was already up and dressed when she entered the kitchen. You should be resting, she scolded gently, taking the coffee pot from his hands. Been resting for weeks, Henry replied with a dismissive wave. Having you here has put new life in these old bones. Now let me show you where everything is. Together, they prepared a hearty breakfast of flapjacks, bacon, and eggs. Grace was just setting the table when a knock came at the door precisely at 7 o'clock. Henry went to answer it, returning with Vance, who looked freshly shaven and more rested than he had the previous day. Morning, Vance greeted, nodding to both of them. He held his hat in his hands, looking almost boyish in his uncertainty. Brought these, he added, producing a small paper bag. Baker was just opening up. Inside the bag were 3 cinnamon rolls, still warm from the oven. The thoughtful gesture touched Grace deeply. Thank you, she said, taking the bag. They smell wonderful. Breakfast was a pleasant affair, with conversation flowing more naturally than the night before. Henry regaled them with stories of Silverton's early days, when the mining camp was just beginning to transform into a proper town. Vance listened attentively, occasionally asking questions that revealed his genuine interest. What are your plans for today? Grace asked as they finished eating. Vance's expression grew more serious. Need to ask around town, find out exactly where my man is staying at the miners' camp. Might take most of the day. Will it be dangerous? She couldn't help asking, concern evident in her voice. Something flickered in Vance's eyes, surprise, perhaps, at her worry for him. Not the asking, he replied. The taking maybe, but that's the job. Henry cleared his throat. I've got to open the assay office soon. Grace, why don't you show Vance around town? Might help him get his bearings. Grace looked at her uncle in surprise, suspecting his motives weren't entirely altruistic. I'm sure Mr. Thornton Vance knows his way around a mining town. Actually, Vance said, a guide would be helpful, if you're willing. Their eyes met across the table, and Grace felt that now familiar flutter in her chest. I'd be happy to help, she said softly. After helping Henry clear the breakfast dishes, Grace fetched her shawl, and she and Vance set out into the morning sunshine. Silverton was already bustling with activity, miners heading to their claims, shopkeepers opening their establishments, wagons delivering goods to the various businesses. Where should we start? Grace asked, suddenly aware that she was alone with Vance for the first time since their journey. Sheriff's office, Vance replied. Best place to get information on newcomers to town. They walked side by side down the main street, close but not touching. Grace was acutely aware of the curious glances they received from townspeople, a well-dressed woman in the company of a man who was obviously a frontiersman of some sort. She found she didn't mind the attention. In fact, there was a certain pride in being seen with Vance, whose quiet strength and dignity set him apart from ordinary men. The sheriff's office was a small wooden building with a single cell visible through the window. Inside, they found a middle-aged man with a silver badge pinned to his vest, his boots propped up on a desk as he read a newspaper. "Sheriff," Vance greeted, touching the brim of his hat. "Vance Thornton. I sent a wire about a fugitive I'm tracking." The sheriff lowered his paper, eyeing them both. "Thornton, right, expecting you." His gaze shifted to Grace. "Madam, this is Miss Grace Calloway," Vance explained. "Henry Calloway's niece. She's been kind enough to show me around town." Understanding dawned in the sheriff's eyes. "Old Henry's niece, eh? Welcome to Silverton, Miss Calloway." He turned his attention back to Vance. "Your man's up at Miner's Rest, boarding house about 2 miles outside town. Been there about a week, calling himself John Smith." Vance nodded, unsurprised by the alias. "He alone, far as I know," the sheriff replied. "Keeps to himself, comes into town every few days for supplies. Due in today, according to the pattern." "Much obliged," Vance said. "I'll keep an eye out for him." As they left the sheriff's office, Grace could sense a change in Vance, a heightened alertness, a subtle tension in his shoulders. The bounty hunter was now fully present, the man who had shared breakfast at her uncle's table momentarily set aside. "Will you confront him in town?" she asked as they walked. Vance shook his head. "Too many people could get hurt. Better to watch, follow him back to the boarding house when he leaves." The practical, thoughtful approach reassured Grace. Vance wasn't a reckless man, not someone who would endanger innocent bystanders in pursuit of his quarry. It confirmed what she had already begun to suspect, that, beneath his dangerous profession, beat the heart of a man with principles. They spent the morning walking through town, with Grace pointing out the various establishments and sharing what little she knew of them from her uncle's letters. Vance was attentive, but she could tell that part of his mind was always elsewhere, scanning the faces of people they passed, watching for the man he sought. Around midday, they stopped at a small cafe for lunch. As they waited for their food, Grace decided to ask the question that had been on her mind since the previous evening. "What will you do when you're done bounty hunting?" she asked. Vance looked surprised by the question. "Never given it much thought," he admitted. "Always figured I'd keep at it until I couldn't anymore." "And then," Grace pressed gently. Vance was quiet for a moment, his blue eyes thoughtful. "Maybe buy some land somewhere, Montana perhaps, always liked the country up there. Alone." The word slipped out before Grace could stop it, and she immediately regretted her boldness. But Vance didn't seem offended. Instead, he regarded her with an intensity that made her breath catch. "Been alone a long time," he said softly. "Started to think that's just how it would always be." He paused, then added, "Until recently." The implication hung in the air between them, unspoken but unmistakable. Grace felt her heart quicken, and for a moment she was back by that campfire, her hand on his chest, feeling the steady beat beneath her palm. Their food arrived, breaking the moment, but something had shifted between them, an acknowledgement of possibilities neither had dared to consider before. As they ate, their conversation turned to lighter topics, books they had read, places they had seen, childhood memories that brought smiles to both their faces. Grace found herself laughing more than she had in years, drawn out of her usual reserve by Vance's dry humor and thoughtful observations. They were just finishing their meal when Vance suddenly stiffened, his gaze fixed on something over her shoulder. "Don't turn around," he said quietly. "Man who just walked into the general store across the street. That's him." Grace fought the urge to look, keeping her eyes on Vance instead. "What will you do?" "Wait until he's done shopping. Follow him out of town," Vance replied, his voice calm but focused. "I need you to go back to your uncle's place now, Grace." But she began to protest. "Please," Vance said, his eyes meeting hers with an intensity that silenced her objection. "I don't want you anywhere near this. These men can be unpredictable when cornered." The concern in his voice was genuine, and Grace realized he wasn't dismissing her, he was protecting her. "All right," she agreed reluctantly, "but promise me you'll be careful." Something softened in Vance's expression. "I promise," he said, reaching across the table to briefly touch her hand. "I'll come by this evening, let you know how it went." The touch was brief but electric, sending warmth through Grace's entire body. She nodded, unable to find words for the emotions swirling within her. Finally, she stood, gathering her shawl. "I'll hold you to that promise, Vance Thornton." As she walked back to her uncle's house, Grace found herself offering a silent prayer for Vance's safety. The thought of him facing danger alone troubled her more deeply than it should have after such a short acquaintance. But in her heart, she knew that what was growing between them was anything but ordinary. The afternoon passed with agonizing slowness. Grace tried to occupy herself by helping her uncle in the assay office, learning about his work testing ore samples from the surrounding mines. But her mind kept returning to Vance, wondering where he was, if he was safe, if he had apprehended his quarry. As evening approached, she prepared dinner with extra care, wanting everything to be perfect for when Vance returned if he returned. The thought that he might not come back, that something might have gone wrong, gnawed at her with increasing intensity as the hours passed. Henry watched her fussing over the stew pot with knowing eyes. "He'll be back," he said gently. "Men like Thornton don't go down easy." "I barely know him," Grace said, more to herself than to her uncle. "It's foolish to worry so much," Henry smiled. "The heart doesn't always wait for proper introductions, my dear. Your Aunt Mary and I knew each other just 3 days before I asked her to marry me. Sometimes, you just know." Grace stirred the stew, unwilling to examine too closely the implications of her uncle's words. Was that what this was, love? So soon, so unexpectedly. It seemed impossible, and yet the ache in her chest at the thought of Vance in danger felt very real indeed. The sun had set, and they were just about to sit down to dinner when a knock came at the door. Grace's heart leaped into her throat as Henry went to answer it. Please let it be him, she thought desperately. And then Vance was there, standing in the doorway, looking tired but unharmed. Relief washed over Grace so powerfully that she had to grip the back of a chair to steady herself. "Evening," Vance greeted, nodding to both of them. "Sorry I'm late." "Not at all," Henry said, ushering him inside. "We were just about to eat. Join us." Vance hesitated, glancing at Grace. "Don't want to impose." "You're not imposing," she said quickly, perhaps too quickly. "There's plenty." Over dinner, Vance recounted the events of the afternoon, how he had followed his quarry back to the miners' boarding house, waited until the man was alone, and then made his move. There had been a brief struggle, but Vance had prevailed, subduing the fugitive and bringing him back to the Silverton jail. "Sheriff's holding him until the marshal arrives from Denver day after tomorrow," Vance concluded. "I'll need to stay until then, sign some papers, collect the bounty." "And then?" Grace asked, trying to keep her voice casual. Vance's eyes met hers across the table. "Haven't decided yet," he said softly. The answer hung between them, full of unspoken possibilities. Henry, sensing the moment, cleared his throat and stood. "Think I'll turn in early," he announced. "Been a long day. Grace, why don't you and Mr. Thornton sit by the fire a while? Night's getting chilly." Before either could protest, Henry had retreated to his bedroom, leaving them alone in the small parlor. Grace busied herself clearing the table, feeling suddenly shy. Vance rose to help her, their hands occasionally brushing as they worked together, each touch sending a jolt through her system. When the kitchen was tidy, they moved to the parlor, where a small fire crackled in the hearth. They sat side by side on the sofa, close but not touching, the silence between them comfortable yet charged with unspoken thoughts. "I was worried about you today," Grace admitted finally, her voice barely above a whisper. Vance turned to look at her, the firelight casting warm shadows across his face. "Been doing this a long time," he said. "Know how to handle myself." "I know," Grace replied, "but I worried all the same." Something shifted in Vance's expression, a softening, a vulnerability he rarely allowed himself to show. "No one's worried about me in a very long time," he said quietly. The simple statement broke Grace's heart a little. How lonely his life must have been, always moving, always hunting, never allowing himself to form attachments that might last. On impulse, she reached out and took his hand, threading her fingers through his. "Well, someone worries now," she said softly. Vance looked down at their joined hands, then back to her face. The intensity in his blue eyes made her breath catch. Slowly, deliberately, he raised her hand to his chest, placing it over his heart just as he had done that first night by the fire. "It's still yours," he said, his voice low and rough with emotion. "If you want it." This time, there was no mistaking his meaning. Grace felt the strong, steady beat beneath her palm, the warmth of him through his shirt, and knew with sudden clarity that this was what she had been searching for without realizing it, this connection, this man. "Vance," she whispered, unable to find more words. He reached up with his free hand to touch her cheek, his calloused fingers gentle against her skin. "Known you barely 2 days," he said. "Feels like I've been waiting for you my whole life." The raw honesty in his words moved her deeply. "I feel it too," she admitted. "It doesn't make sense, but some things don't need to make sense," Vance interrupted softly. "Some things just are." And then he was leaning forward, and she was meeting him halfway, and their lips came together in a kiss that felt like coming home after a long journey. His mouth was warm and tender against hers, the kiss gentle at first, then deepening as she responded to him. Grace had been kissed before chased, proper kisses from suitors in Denver, but nothing like this. Nothing that made her feel as though her very soul was reaching for his. Nothing that set her heart racing and her body yearning for more. When they finally parted, both breathing quickly, Vance rested his forehead against hers. "Been thinking about doing that since I first saw you by my fire," he confessed. Grace smiled, joy bubbling up inside her. "I'm glad you waited until now," she teased. "I might have thought you were taking advantage." Vance chuckled, the sound warming her even more than the fire. "Never that," he said seriously. "You deserve better than a drifter with nothing to offer but a heart that's been too long alone." "Don't," Grace said firmly, placing her fingers against his lips. "Don't diminish what you are. You're a good man, Vance Thornton, a man of honor and courage. That's worth more than all the riches in Denver." He captured her hand, pressing a kiss to her palm that sent shivers through her. "What happens now?" he asked. "I leave in 2 days. You're here with your uncle." The question brought reality crashing back. Grace hadn't thought beyond this moment, hadn't considered the practical implications of these feelings that had bloomed so unexpectedly between them. "I don't know," she admitted. "Uncle Henry needs me, at least for a while, and you have your work." Vance was quiet for a moment, thinking. "Could come back," he said finally. "After the next job, see how things stand then." Hope flared in Grace's chest. "You would do that? Come back to Silverton?" "Would come back for you," Vance clarified, his blue eyes intense. "If you wanted me to, I would," Grace said without hesitation. "Very much." He smiled then, a full, genuine smile that transformed his face, making him look younger, lighter. "Then that's what I'll do. Take my prisoner to Denver, collect the bounty, handle one more job I promised to take. Shouldn't be more than a month." A month seemed both an eternity and no time at all. Grace knew that, in that time, her feelings for Vance would only deepen, the certainty growing in her heart that this was right, that he was the one she had been waiting for without knowing it. "I'll be here," she promised. Waiting. They spent the rest of the evening by the fire, talking of everything and nothing, occasionally falling into comfortable silences broken only by the crackling of the flames. When it grew late, Vance reluctantly rose to leave. "Stay for breakfast?" Grace asked, walking him to the door. "Wouldn't miss it," Vance replied, his hand gently caressing her cheek. "Sleep well, Grace." "You too," she whispered, standing on tiptoe to press one more kiss to his lips before he disappeared into the night. The next day passed in a blur of joy and anticipation for Grace. She helped her uncle in the assay office, prepared meals, and spent every possible moment with Vance. They walked through town together, no longer concerned with the curious glances of townspeople. In the afternoon, they rode to a nearby meadow where wildflowers grew in abundance, and Vance surprised her by naming many of them, knowledge gained from years of living off the land. "Never figured you for a man who knew flowers," Grace teased as they sat on a blanket among the blooms. Vance smiled, reaching out to tuck a blue columbine behind her ear. "Need to know what's safe to eat, what's poisonous, what can be used for medicine," he explained. "Beauty's just a bonus." The gentle touch of his fingers against her temple sent warmth spreading through her. It amazed Grace how quickly she had become accustomed to his touch, how natural it felt to be close to him, as if they had known each other for years rather than days. "Tell me about Montana," she said, leaning back on her hands. "Why there?" Vance stretched out beside her, his hat tipped back to reveal his face to the sunshine. "Big sky country," he said. Open land, good grazing, not as settled as other places. Man can breathe there, make his own way. It sounds beautiful, Grace said, trying to imagine it. It is, Vance confirmed. Thought about buying land there before, never quite got around to it. Always another bounty, another chase. And now, Grace asked softly. Vance turned his head to look at her, his blue eyes thoughtful. Now I'm thinking it might be time to stop running. Find a place to build something that lasts. The implication hung in the air between them, a future neither had dared to speak of directly yet. Grace's heart quickened at the thought of home with Vance, a life together in that big sky country he loved so much. I've never been further west than Colorado, she said, but I've always wanted to see more of the country. Vance reached for her hand, his strong fingers entwining with hers. Could show you, he offered. After I come back. Grace squeezed his hand, happiness blooming within her. I'd like that. They stayed in the meadow until the sun began to sink toward the mountains, talking of their pasts, their hopes, their dreams. With each shared story, each laugh, each quiet moment, the connection between them deepened, solidified into something neither could deny or want to. That evening, after dinner with Henry, they sat on the small porch of the house, watching the stars appear one by one in the darkening sky. Vance's arm was around Grace's shoulders, her head resting against him, a comfortable silence between them. Grace, Vance said after a while, his voice low. Need to ask you something. She lifted her head to look at him, curious. What is it? Vance seemed to struggle with his words, unusual for a man who, while not talkative, was always direct. When I come back, he finally began, would you? That is, I know it's soon, but I've never been more certain of anything. Grace's heart began to race as she realized what he was trying to ask. Yes, she said simply. Vance blinked. Didn't ask the question yet. She smiled, reaching up to touch his face. The answer is yes anyway. Whether you're asking me to wait for you or to go with you when you return, or anything else, yes. Understanding dawned in his eyes, followed by a joy so pure it transformed his face. Grace Calloway, he said, taking her hands in his. When I come back, will you marry me? Build a life with me, wherever that might take us. Though she had already given her answer, hearing the question spoken aloud brought tears to Grace's eyes. Yes, Vance Thornton, she whispered. I will marry you. He kissed her then, a kiss full of promise and future and love that had bloomed swiftly but deeply in the most unexpected of circumstances. When they parted, both breathing quickly, Vance reached into his pocket and pulled out a small object. Not a proper ring, he said apologetically, opening his hand to reveal a simple silver band etched with a pattern of leaves. Bought it from the silversmith in town today. Can get you something better in Denver, it's perfect, Grace interrupted, taking the ring from his palm. It was beautiful in its simplicity, exactly what she would have chosen for herself. I love it, Vance. He took the ring back and slid it onto her finger, his hand steady but his eyes betraying the depth of his emotion. Belongs there, he said softly, just like you belong with me. Grace looked down at the silver band gleaming in the starlight, then back to the face of the man who had so unexpectedly captured her heart. How did this happen? She wondered aloud. 4 days ago we were strangers. Vance smiled, drawing her close again. Some things don't need time, he said. Some things just are. They stayed on the porch until the night grew cool, planning their future in quiet voices, a ranch in Montana, perhaps children someday, a life built on the love that had sparked by a campfire in the wilderness. When Vance finally left for his hotel, it was with the promise of one more day together before he had to depart with his prisoner. Grace watched him go, the silver ring a comforting weight on her finger, her heart full of joy and anticipation for what was to come. The next morning, Grace woke to the sound of raised voices. Alarmed, she hurried to dress and made her way to the kitchen, where she found Henry and Vance in serious conversation. What's happened? She asked. Immediately sensing something was wrong, Vance turned to her, his expression grim. Marshals arrived early, wants to leave with the prisoner right away. I need to go with them. The news hit Grace like a physical blow. Today was supposed to be their last day together before a month's separation. Now it seemed they would have only minutes. How soon? She asked, fighting to keep her voice steady. Within the hour, Vance replied. I'm sorry, Grace. I tried to convince him to wait until tomorrow, but he's insistent. Henry cleared his throat. "I'll give you two a moment," he said tactfully, retreating to the porch with his coffee. Once alone, Vance crossed the room to take Grace in his arms. "This doesn't change anything," he said firmly. "I'll still come back as soon as I can." Grace nodded against his chest, breathing in his scent, trying to memorize everything about this moment. "I know," she whispered. "I just thought we'd have today." Vance tilted her chin up, his blue eyes intense. "1 month," he promised. "No longer, then I'll be back for you and nothing on this earth will keep me away." Grace managed a smile, determined not to send him off with tears. "I'll be waiting," she said. Every day. They kissed, a kiss filled with both promise and regret, promise for the future they would build together, regret for the time they would spend apart. When they parted, Vance pressed his forehead to hers, his hands cradling her face as if she were the most precious thing he had ever held. "I love you, Grace Calloway," he said, the words simple but profound. "Never thought I'd say that to anyone, but there it is. I love you." Joy bloomed in Grace's chest despite the impending separation. "And I love you, Vance Thornton," she replied. "Come back to me." "Wild horses couldn't keep me away," he promised. All too soon, it was time for him to go. Grace and Henry walked with him to the sheriff's office, where the marshal and his deputies were preparing to depart with their prisoner. The farewell was necessarily brief and public, with Vance merely touching her cheek and reminding her of his promise to return. 1 month, he said again, his eyes holding hers. 1 month, she echoed, her finger touching the silver ring he had given her. And then he was gone, riding out of Silverton with the marshal's party, looking back once to raise his hand in farewell before disappearing around a bend in the road. Henry placed a comforting arm around Grace's shoulders. "He'll be back," he said with certainty. "Men like that keep their word." Grace nodded, already feeling the ache of Vance's absence. "I know," she said softly, "but it's going to be a very long month." The days that followed settled into a routine for Grace. She helped her uncle in the assay office, learned to cook his favorite meals, and gradually became acquainted with the people of Silverton. Many were curious about the bounty hunter's girl, as they called her, but most were kind, accepting her as Henry's niece and a new member of their community. In the evenings, she would sit on the porch and watch the road that led into town, hoping against hope that Vance might return early. She wrote long letters to him, saving them to give him when he returned, pouring out her thoughts and feelings, her hopes for their future together. 2 weeks after Vance's departure, a letter arrived for Grace, delivered by a rider from Denver. Her hands trembled as she opened it, recognizing Vance's neat, precise handwriting. "My dearest Grace, reached Denver safely with the prisoner. Marshall says to thank your uncle for his help in the matter. The job I mentioned will take me to Wyoming, not as far as I feared. Should still be able to return to Silverton within the month as promised. Think of you constantly, never knew a man could miss someone this much. Keep your uncle well. Keep yourself safer. I'll come back to you, come hell or high water. All my love." Vance. Grace pressed the letter to her heart, tears of happiness springing to her eyes. Though brief, the words confirmed what she already knew, that Vance's feelings were as true and deep as her own, that their future together was certain. She wrote back immediately, sending her reply with a stage driver heading to Denver the next day. In her letter, she told Vance about her days in Silverton, about the silver ring that never left her finger, about how the stars seemed to shine brighter when she imagined sharing them with him. The weeks continued to pass, each day bringing her closer to Vance's return. Grace found herself counting the days, then the hours, anticipation building within her as the month drew to a close. On the morning of the day Vance had promised to return, Grace woke early, unable to contain her excitement. She dressed with special care, choosing a blue dress that brought out the color of her eyes, arranging her hair in the style he had once complimented. "You look beautiful," Henry said when she emerged from her room. "Your young man won't know what hit him." Grace smiled, touching the silver ring on her finger. "Do you think he'll come today?" "If he said a month, then it will be a month," Henry replied confidently. "That one strikes me as a man who keeps his word." Throughout the day, Grace found it impossible to concentrate on anything. She moved restlessly from window to porch and back again, watching the road into town, her heart leaping at the sight of every rider who appeared. By late afternoon, when there was still no sign of Vance, doubt began to creep in. Perhaps he had been delayed. Perhaps the job in Wyoming had taken longer than expected. Perhaps, in this thought, she tried desperately to suppress something had happened to him. "He'll come," Henry reassured her, seeing her worry. "Might be tomorrow instead of today, but he'll come." Grace nodded, trying to hold on to her faith in Vance's promise. "Of course he will," she said, more to convince herself than her uncle. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the main street of Silverton, Grace sat on the porch, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. One more day, she told herself. She would give him one more day before she allowed herself to truly worry. She was so lost in thought that she almost missed the sound of hoofbeats approaching at a steady pace. Looking up, she saw a rider coming down the street, silhouetted against the setting sun. Something about the set of his shoulders, the way he sat in the saddle, made her heart begin to race. Slowly, Grace stood, shielding her eyes against the fading light. As the rider drew closer, she could make out more details: the wide-brimmed hat, the familiar buckskin horse, the confident posture that could belong to only one man. "Vance," she whispered, and then she was running, her skirts gathered in her hands, her heart pounding with joy and relief. Vance saw her coming and dismounted in one fluid motion, tying his horse to a hitching post before striding to meet her. They came together in the middle of the street, heedless of any onlookers, Vance catching Grace in his arms and lifting her off her feet in an embrace that spoke of a month's worth of longing. "You came back," Grace said when he finally set her down, her hands framing his face, reassuring herself that he was real, that he was here. "Promised I would," Vance replied, his blue eyes drinking in the sight of her. "Would have moved heaven and earth to keep that promise." And then he was kissing her, right there in the middle of Silverton's Main Street, a kiss that made up for a month of separation, a kiss that held all the love and longing and promise of their future together. When they finally parted, both breathing quickly, Vance rested his forehead against hers. "Missed you something fierce," he admitted, his voice rough with emotion. "And I missed you," Grace replied, her fingers tracing the lines of his face, noting the new scar along his jawline that hadn't been there before. "You're hurt." Vance shook his head dismissively. "It's nothing. Job got a little complicated, but it's done now and I'm here." There would be time later for him to tell her about Wyoming, about the complications that had left their mark on him. For now, it was enough that he had returned as promised, that they were together again. Hand in hand, they walked back to Henry's house, where the old man was waiting on the porch with a knowing smile. "Right on time, Mr. Thornton," he said, extending his hand. "Just as I told Grace you would be." Vance shook Henry's hand firmly. "Thank you for looking after her, sir." "She looked after me, more like," Henry replied with a chuckle. "Come inside, both of you. Dinner's almost ready, and I imagine you've got plenty to talk about." Over a hearty meal of venison stew and fresh bread, Vance recounted his month away the journey to Denver with the prisoner, the job in Wyoming that had proven more dangerous than anticipated, and his determination to return to Silverton exactly when he had promised. "Could have been back yesterday," he admitted, "but wanted to arrive exactly a month from when I left. A promise is a promise." Grace's heart swelled with love for this man who valued his word so highly, who had crossed mountains and faced dangers to return to her as he had said he would. After dinner, they sat on the porch together, Vance's arm around Grace's shoulders, her head resting against him just as it had a month ago when he had asked her to marry him. "Been thinking," Vance said after a comfortable silence. "About our future." Grace looked up at him, curious. "What about it?" "Found a place," Vance said, a hint of excitement in his voice. "In Montana, like we talked about. Good land, good water. Previous owner passed away, his widow's selling cheap. Went to see it on my way back from Wyoming." Grace sat up straighter, her heart racing. "You bought land?" Vance nodded, a smile spreading across his face. 300 acres. House needs work, but it's solid. Good grazing land for cattle, creek running through the property." "Vance," Grace breathed, hardly daring to believe it. "You did this for us." "For our future," he confirmed, taking her hands in his. "If you still want that future with me." "More than anything," Grace whispered, tears of joy welling in her eyes. Vance reached into his pocket and withdrew a small box. "Got you something else in Denver," he said, opening it to reveal a simple gold band set with a small diamond. "To go with the silver one. Thought you deserved a proper engagement ring." Grace gasped at the beautiful ring, then looked down at the silver band on her finger. "But I love this one," she protested. "You gave it to me when you proposed." Vance smiled, understanding in his eyes. "Then wear both," he suggested. "The silver to remind us of where we started, the gold to show where we're going." He slid the gold ring onto her finger beside the silver one, and Grace marveled at how perfectly they looked together, different but complementary, just like her and Vance. "When?" she asked, looking up at him. "When can we start our life together?" "Soon as you want," Vance replied. "Could get married here in Silverton, head to Montana after. Or wait until we get there, if you prefer." Grace thought of her uncle, of his kindness and support. "Here," she said decisively, "with Uncle Henry to give me away, then Montana to start our new life." Vance nodded, clearly pleased with her decision. 2 weeks, he suggested. "Give us time to prepare, get to know each other a bit more." Grace laughed softly. 2 weeks sounds perfect, she agreed, "though I already know everything I need to know about you, Vance Thornton." "And what's that?" he asked, his blue eyes warm in the fading light. "That you're a man of your word," Grace replied, leaning up to kiss him gently. "That you're kind and brave and honorable, that your heart is true, and that you're mine just as I'm yours." Vance pulled her closer, his arms strong around her. "Always will be," he promised. "From the moment you offered to tend my fire, my heart was yours for the taking." They stayed on the porch until the stars came out, planning their wedding, their journey to Montana, the life they would build together. And as Grace leaned against the man she loved, his steady heartbeat beneath her ear, she marveled at how a chance encounter in the wilderness had led to this, a love that would last a lifetime, a future brighter than she had ever dared to dream. The next 2 weeks passed in a whirlwind of preparation and joy. Word of their engagement spread quickly through Silverton, and to Grace's surprise, the townspeople embraced the news with genuine happiness. The bounty hunter and the schoolteacher from Denver made an unusual pair, but something about their story captured the imagination and approval of the small mining community. Vance proved himself to be more than just a skilled tracker and fighter during those days. He helped Henry repair the roof of the assay office, split firewood for the coming winter, and even assisted the local blacksmith with shoeing horses when an extra pair of strong hands was needed. Grace watched with pride as the town gradually accepted him not as a dangerous drifter, but as a man of worth and character. In the evenings, they would walk together through town or sit on the porch of Henry's house, learning more about each other, deepening the connection that had formed so swiftly between them. Grace told Vance about her dreams of perhaps starting a small school someday, wherever they settled. Vance spoke of his plans for their ranch in Montana, the cattle he hoped to raise, the garden they might plant, the home they would build together. "Never thought much about the future before," he admitted one evening as they sat beneath the stars. "Always just the next job, the next bounty. Never seemed worth planning beyond that." Grace rested her head on his shoulder, her hand entwined with his. "And now," Vance smiled, kissing the top of her head, "now I can't stop thinking about it, our home, children someday maybe, growing old together." The simple words painted a picture so beautiful that it brought tears to Grace's eyes. "I want that too," she whispered. "All of it." 3 days before the wedding, a package arrived for Grace from Denver, her wedding dress, ordered through the Silverton General Store. It was simpler than what she might have chosen in Denver, but perfect for a bride in a mining town, ivory satin with delicate lace at the collar and cuffs, a modest train that would accommodate the walk to the small church. As the dressmaker's wife helped her with the final fitting, Grace caught sight of herself in the mirror and barely recognized the woman who looked back at her. Her cheeks were flushed with happiness, her eyes bright with love and anticipation. She looked like a woman who had found her place in the world, who knew exactly where she belonged and with whom. "You look beautiful, dear," the dressmaker's wife said, adjusting the fall of the skirt. "Your young man won't know what hit him." Grace smiled, touching the 2 rings on her finger, the silver and the gold, the past and the future. "Thank you," she said softly. for everything. The night before the wedding, Henry insisted on hosting a small dinner for the couple and a few close friends he had made in town: the sheriff and his wife, the doctor who had tended him during his illness, the minister who would perform the ceremony the next day. It was a warm, lively gathering, with good food, better wine, and stories that kept everyone laughing well into the evening. Grace found herself looking around the table, marveling at how quickly Silverton had begun to feel like home, how these people had become friends in the short time she had been there. When the guests had gone and Henry had retired for the night, Grace and Vance stood on the porch for their last moments together before the wedding. Tradition dictated they spend the night apart, with Vance returning to his room at the hotel until the ceremony. "Next time I see you, you'll be walking down the aisle," Vance said, holding her close. Grace smiled up at him, her heart full. "Are you nervous?" Vance considered the question seriously. "Not about marrying you," he said finally. "That's the surest thing I've ever known." "Bit nervous about being a good husband, though. Don't exactly have much experience with family life." The honest admission touched Grace deeply. "We'll learn together," she promised. "That's what matters." They shared one last kiss beneath the stars, a kiss full of promise and anticipation for the day to come. Then Vance reluctantly pulled away, touching her cheek gently. "Until tomorrow, Grace Calloway," he said softly. "Until tomorrow, Vance Thornton," she replied. "When I become Grace Thornton." The smile that spread across his face at those words was worth everything: every moment of uncertainty, every day of separation, every fear she had overcome to reach this point. "I like the sound of that," he said, his blue eyes warm with love. The wedding day dawned clear and crisp, a perfect autumn morning in the mountains. Grace woke early, too excited to sleep, and spent the morning preparing with the help of the sheriff's wife and the dressmaker, who had both volunteered to assist her. Henry appeared at her bedroom door just before it was time to leave for the church, his eyes widening at the sight of her in her wedding dress, her auburn hair arranged in soft curls beneath a simple veil. "You look just like your mother on her wedding day," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "She would be so proud of you, Grace." Grace blinked back tears, careful not to ruin the light touches of powder and rouge the dressmaker had applied. "Thank you, Uncle Henry," she said, taking his arm, "for everything, for welcoming me, for supporting us, for being here today." Henry patted her hand where it rested on his arm. "Proud to do it," he said simply. "That young man of yours is one in a million, known it from the moment I met him." They made their way to the small church at the end of the main street, where it seemed half the town had gathered to witness the union of the bounty hunter and the schoolteacher. Grace waited in the small antechamber while the guests were seated, her heart racing with anticipation. And then the music began. A simple melody played on the church's old piano and the doors opened, and Grace stepped into the church on her uncle's arm. The sight that greeted her took her breath away. Vance stood at the altar, dressed in a new black suit, his hair neatly combed, his face freshly shaven. But it was his expression that made her heart skip a beat, the look of absolute wonder and love in his eyes as he saw her for the first time in her wedding dress. For Grace, the rest of the world fell away as she walked down the aisle toward him. There were no guests, no church, nothing but Vance waiting for her, his blue eyes never leaving hers, his hand extended as she reached the altar. The ceremony itself was a blur of emotion: the minister's words, the vows they exchanged, the simple gold bands they placed on each other's fingers. Through it all, Grace was anchored by Vance's steady presence, his hand warm and strong around hers, his voice clear and certain as he promised to love and cherish her for all the days of his life. "I now pronounce you husband and wife," the minister said at last. "You may kiss your bride." Vance's hands were gentle as he lifted her veil, his eyes filled with a love so profound it made Grace's heart ache with joy. And then he was kissing her, a kiss that sealed their vows and began their life together, a kiss that promised forever. The celebration that followed at the town hall was more exuberant than Grace had expected, with music and dancing and enough food to feed twice the number of guests. It seemed everyone in Silverton had contributed something to the feast: roasted venison from the hunters, fresh bread from the baker's wife, pies and cakes from what seemed like every kitchen in town. "They've taken to you," Henry observed as he danced with Grace, nodding toward the townspeople who were celebrating with such enthusiasm. "Both of you. They'll miss you when you go." Grace looked across the room to where Vance was engaged in conversation with the sheriff, his expression animated as he described something with his hands. Her heart swelled with love for this man who had so unexpectedly become her husband. "We'll come back to visit," she promised her uncle. "Often, see that you do," Henry replied with a smile, "and maybe I'll come to Montana someday, see this ranch of yours." "You'd better," Grace said firmly. "We'll have a room waiting for you always." As the evening progressed, Grace and Vance moved among their guests, accepting congratulations and well wishes from what felt like the entire town. Through it all, Vance kept her close, his hand often finding hers, his eyes seeking her out whenever they were separated even briefly. Finally, as the celebration began to wind down, Vance led Grace outside to the cool night air. Above them, the stars shone brightly in the clear mountain sky, the same stars that had witnessed their first evening together by the campfire, that had looked down on them as they fell in love. "Happy, Mrs. Thornton?" Vance asked, his arms circling her waist. Grace smiled up at him, the title sending a thrill through her. "Happier than I've ever been," she replied honestly. "And you, Mr. Thornton?" Vance's answer was to pull her closer, his kiss conveying everything words could not: his love, his joy, his gratitude for the woman who had offered to tend his fire and unknowingly claimed his heart in the process. "When do we leave for Montana?" Grace asked when they finally parted. "Day after tomorrow," Vance replied. "Thought we'd stay one more day, spend time with your uncle, make sure everything's settled before we go." Grace nodded, grateful for his thoughtfulness. "And then our new life begins." "It began the moment I met you," Vance said softly. "Everything since has just been finding our way home." Home. The word had never held such meaning for Grace as it did now, standing in the arms of the man she loved, looking toward a future they would build together. Home wasn't Denver, where she had lived most of her life. It wasn't Silverton, where she had found love. It was wherever she and Vance were together: a campfire in the wilderness, a ranch in Montana, any place where their hearts beat as one. "I love you, Vance Thornton," she whispered, reaching up to touch his face, "with all that I am." "And I love you, Grace Thornton," he replied, his voice rough with emotion. "Always will, till my last breath and beyond." They stood together beneath the stars, newlyweds on the threshold of their life together. A life that had begun with a simple offer to tend a fire, and a cowboy's heart laid bare beneath a woman's hand. And in that moment, Grace knew with absolute certainty that whatever challenges the future might hold, they would face them together, their love a flame that would burn brightly through all the days and years to come. 1 year later, the Montana sunrise painted the sky in shades of pink and gold as Grace stepped onto the porch of their ranch house, a steaming cup of coffee in her hands. The air was crisp with the promise of autumn, the surrounding mountains dusted with the first light snow of the season. "Beautiful morning," Vance said, coming up behind her and slipping his arms around her waist. Grace leaned back against his chest, smiling as she felt him rest his chin on top of her head. "It is," she agreed, "though I think there's a storm coming later." Vance nodded, his eyes scanning the distant clouds. "Probably. Need to bring in the last of the hay today, just to be safe." Their first year on the ranch had been one of hard work and endless challenges: rebuilding fences, repairing the house, acquiring their first small herd of cattle. But it had also been filled with joy, with a sense of purpose and belonging that neither had ever experienced before. "Uncle Henry's letter arrived yesterday while you were checking the north pasture," Grace said, turning in his arms to face him. "He says he'll definitely come for Christmas this year." Vance smiled, pleased at the news. "Good. Been too long since we've seen him." Their wedding trip to Montana had been the beginning of a new chapter for both of them. The ranch Vance had purchased turned out to be even more promising than he had described: 300 acres of good grazing land with a sturdy if somewhat neglected house, a barn that needed only minor repairs, and a creek that provided fresh water year-round. They had worked side by side to make it a home, Grace planting a garden, and adding feminine touches to the interior of the house. Vance focusing on the barn and outbuildings, both of them learning the business of cattle ranching together. The bounty hunter had hung up his guns for good, though they remained mounted on the wall of their bedroom, a reminder of the man he had been, the path that had led him to grace. In their place, he had taken up the tools of a rancher, rope and saddle, branding iron and fence pliers. To Grace's surprise, Vance had proven to be a natural at ranching, his skills as a tracker and his knowledge of the land transferring easily to his new profession. The local ranchers had been wary at first of the former bounty hunter in their midst, but his quiet competence and fair dealings had gradually won their respect. Grace, too, had found her place in their new community. She had started a small school for the children of neighboring ranches, teaching 3 days a week in a converted bunkhouse on their property. The work fulfilled her in ways she hadn't expected, bringing together her love of learning and her growing attachment to the wild, beautiful country they now called home. "What time are the Hendersons coming for dinner?" Vance asked, referring to their nearest neighbors whose friendship had been an unexpected blessing. "Around 6, Grace replied. "Sarah's bringing her apple pie." Vance grinned, his blue eyes crinkling at the corners in a way that still made Grace's heart skip a beat. "Almost worth the sound of Jim's opinions on cattle prices then." Grace laughed, playfully swatting his arm. "Be nice. Jim's just passionate about his views." "That's one word for it," Vance muttered, but his tone was good-natured. He had come to genuinely like their opinionated neighbor, even if the man could talk the hind leg off a mule when the subject of cattle markets arose. They stood together for a moment longer, watching the sun rise fully above the mountains, bathing their land in golden light. Then Vance reluctantly stepped back, duty calling. "Better get started on that hay," he said. "Storm's coming, like you said." Grace nodded, understanding the demands of ranch life. "I'll bring lunch out to the field around noon," she promised. Vance smiled, leaning down to kiss her softly. "What did I do to deserve you?" he wondered aloud, not for the first time. "You placed my hand on your heart," Grace replied simply, "and told me it was mine." Something flickered in Vance's eyes, memory, love, a depth of emotion that even after a year of marriage still took Grace's breath away. "Best decision I ever made," he said softly. With one last kiss, he headed toward the barn to begin the day's work. Grace watched him go, admiring the confident stride of the man who had once been a restless drifter but was now rooted firmly in the life they had built together. As she turned to go back inside, her hand instinctively went to her stomach, where the first subtle signs of new life were beginning to show. She hadn't told Vance yet, wanting to be certain before sharing the news that would change their lives once again. Tonight, she decided. After the Hendersons left, when they were alone by the fire, she would tell him about the child that would arrive with the spring, the next chapter in the story that had begun with a campfire in the wilderness, and a woman's offer to tend it. Grace smiled, imagining Vance's reaction to the news. He would be surprised at first, then joyful, then immediately protective and concerned for her welfare. He would insist on her resting more, would take on even more of the ranch work himself, would fuss over her in his quiet, steady way. The thought filled her with a happiness so complete, it brought tears to her eyes. From strangers to husband and wife to parents, a journey neither of them could have imagined that night when fate had brought them together. As she went inside to begin her day's work, Grace Thornton sent up a silent prayer of gratitude for the twists of fate that had led her to that campfire, for the courage of a lonely bounty hunter who had placed her hand on his heart, and for the love that had given them both a home at last. That evening, after a pleasant dinner with the Hendersons, Grace and Vance sat together on the porch swing, watching the storm clouds gather on the horizon. The air was heavy with the scent of rain, the wind picking up and rustling through the trees that surrounded their home. "Got all the hay in just in time," Vance said, his arm around Grace's shoulders. "Should be a good winter with that much feed stored." Grace nodded, leaning into his warmth. The garden did well too, cellars full of preserves and root vegetables. They had fallen into an easy rhythm during their year on the ranch, each taking on the tasks that suited them best, working together when necessary, supporting each other through the inevitable challenges of their new life. It wasn't always easy. There had been arguments and misunderstandings, moments of frustration and exhaustion, but through it all, the love that had sparked so quickly between them had only deepened and strengthened. "Vance," Grace said after a comfortable silence, her heart beginning to race. "There's something I need to tell you." He looked down at her, his expression curious. "What is it?" Grace took a deep breath, then took his hand and placed it gently on her stomach. "We're going to have a baby," she said softly, "in the spring." For a moment, Vance was perfectly still, his hand warm against her through the fabric of her dress. Then his eyes widened, a mixture of wonder and joy spreading across his face. "A baby," he repeated, his voice barely above a whisper. "You're sure?" Grace nodded, smiling through the tears that had begun to form. "Dr. Miller confirmed it yesterday when I went into town for supplies, said everything looks healthy and strong." Vance's hand pressed more firmly against her stomach, as if trying to feel the tiny life growing within. "A baby," he said again, and this time his voice cracked with emotion. "Our baby." And then he was gathering her into his arms, holding her as if she were made of the most precious porcelain, his face buried in her hair. Grace felt the dampness of tears against her neck and realized that her strong, stoic husband was crying tears of joy for the family they were creating together. "I love you," Vance said when he finally pulled back to look at her, his blue eyes shining with unshed tears. "Both of you. So much it scares me sometimes." Grace reached up to touch his face, wiping away a stray tear with her thumb. "Why does it scare you?" Vance covered her hand with his own, turning to press a kiss to her palm. "Because I never knew I could feel this way," he admitted. "Never knew I could have this much to lose." The raw honesty of his words touched Grace deeply. This was the man she had married, not just the brave bounty hunter or the capable rancher, but the vulnerable, loving soul beneath the stoic exterior. "You won't lose us," she promised. "We're right here, Vance. We're home," he smiled then, a smile that transformed his face and revealed the depth of his happiness. "Home," he agreed, pulling her close again. "With you, with our child, that's all I'll ever need." They stayed on the porch until the first heavy drops of rain began to fall, talking about the baby, about the changes it would bring to their lives, about the room they would prepare in the spring. Vance was already making plans: a cradle he would build himself, a small rocking horse for when the child was older, safety measures to child-proof the ranch house. His enthusiasm made Grace laugh with delight. "The baby won't be riding for quite some time," she reminded him when he began discussing how soon they could teach their child to sit a horse. "Never too early to plan," Vance replied with a grin. "Besides, any child of ours is bound to take to horses naturally." As the storm finally broke in earnest, they moved inside to the warmth of their home. Vance built up the fire while Grace made tea, the familiar domestic routine comforting in its simplicity. Sitting together on the sofa before the fire, Vance's hand resting protectively over Grace's still flat stomach, they watched the flames dance and listened to the rain pounding on the roof. "Remember that first night?" Vance asked, his voice thoughtful. "By my campfire," Grace smiled, remembering. "How could I forget? I was half-starved, exhausted, and terrified, and then there you were. And you offered to tend my fire," Vance continued, a smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "Bravest thing I'd ever seen, a woman alone in the wilderness, still thinking of others." "It was the least I could do," Grace said softly. "You shared your food, your fire, your protection." Vance's arms tightened around her. "Shared a lot more than that in the end," he said, his voice low. "Shared my heart, my name, my life, and now we're sharing this." His hand moved gently over the place where their child grew. "Never imagined I could be this happy, Grace." "Nor I," she admitted. "When I left Denver, I thought I was just going to help my uncle. I had no idea I was heading toward the rest of my life." Outside, the storm raged on, wind and rain lashing at the windows, occasional flashes of lightning illuminating the night. But inside their home, all was warmth and peace and love, the love that had begun with a chance encounter, that had grown despite separation and uncertainty, that had flourished in the soil of the life they had built together. As the evening grew late, they moved to their bedroom, Vance helping Grace undress with a tenderness that still made her heart swell. When they lay together in the darkness, his hand never left her stomach, as if he could somehow protect their unborn child through the simple act of touch. "What do you think it will be?" he asked, his voice drowsy in the darkness. "Boy or girl?" Grace smiled, though he couldn't see it. "I don't know," she replied honestly. "Either would be perfect. A girl with your eyes," Vance mused, "or a boy with your spirit. Either way, we're blessed." "We are," Grace agreed, snuggling closer to his warmth. "More than I ever dreamed possible." As she drifted towards sleep, safe in the arms of the man she loved, Grace Thornton reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment, from a campfire in the wilderness to a home filled with love, from strangers to spouses to soon-to-be parents. It had all begun with an offer to tend a fire, with a cowboy who had placed her hand on his heart and said simply, "It's yours." And in the giving of his heart, Vance Thornton had claimed hers in return, setting them both on a path neither could have foreseen, but that had led them, inexorably, home. Outside, the storm gradually subsided, the rain gentling to a soft patter against the roof. And inside, Grace and Vance Thornton slept peacefully in each other's arms, their dreams filled with visions of the future they would build together, a future as vast and promising as the Montana sky above their ranch, as enduring as the love that had brought them home at last.